Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a menace to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey everyone, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome to Menace to Society. I have the great privilege of sitting today in North Pole, Alaska. Yes, it does exist. And I am here with Santa Claus. And yes, he does exist. Hello, Santa.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me to Menace. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you being here. And that is your legal name.
That's my legal name.
And how did that happen?
That happened about 12 years ago. That would be 2005. I had grown out my beard the year before, and a lot of the nonprofit organizations where I was living at Lake Tahoe at the time wanted me to volunteer as Santa, which I did. It was well received. So that February, I was out walking on a cold day up in the mountains to the post office, and it was cold, but kind of clear weather, and some of the cars had their windows open. So this one white nondescript car came up the road, and I had been praying. I'm a monk and also clergy, and been praying what I should do with this new look with the white beard and stuff. And one of the questions I asked during my prayer was, should I change my name to Santa Claus? And right after I finished praying, maybe 20 seconds later, this white car came up, and windows were open. Didn't see who was inside, but whoever it was sounded like they were in their early 20s. It was a guy, and he shouted out, "Santa, I love you." And this was in February, so I just finished praying, so I took that as a sign.
Oh, I think that'd be a definite sign.
Prayer. So that's how that initially happened.
That's fantastic.
But it's been good because at Lake Tahoe, I do a lot of child advocacy, so I'm constantly calling up U.S. senators and governors, asking them to do things for child health, safety, and welfare. And once in a while I get a bill that I want to help support, like Aaron's Law, something like that. And I'll call up, and back then I was saying, hey, this is Santa Claus from Lake Tahoe. That doesn't have the same ring as this is Santa Claus from North Pole, Alaska. Mm-hmm. And that's what prompted me to move up here. Because I was successful doing it from Lake Tahoe, but now it's like 99% effective, which is pretty good.
Right. That upped your political pull?
It does. Yep.
You're the actual living Santa Claus. Megyn Kelly was right. You're a white dude.
I am a white dude. But back in the old days, back in the 4th century, he was from the Mediterranean area, in the area now known as Turkey. So he had darker skin than mine. And Santa Claus, the name, I'm not sure if you know what it's based on.
No.
Years ago, St. Nicholas in the 4th century, who lived over there in Asia Minor, he had this whole reputation for being kind to children, and he had come from a wealthy family and spread his wealth around. And back then, for women in particular whose families didn't have a lot of money, their only other option, aside from being married to somebody, was to go into essentially prostitution. So Nicholas, St. Nicholas is what he became, but Nicholas at the time, who was a bishop, gave dowries essentially on behalf of the families to these women. So that's how the gift giver reputation started. Well, the Dutch, years later, picked up on that whole thing, and their expression for St. Nicholas is Sinterklaas. And when the Dutch, and they have a feast day on December 6th for St. Nicholas in most places of the world. Anyway, when the Dutch settled New York, which is now New York City, but back then was called New Amsterdam, they brought that tradition, the Feast of St. Nicholas and Sinterklaas, with them. Well, Sinterklaas became Santa Claus, and because Santa is a feminine word, so Santa came from the Sinterklaas. Anyway, make a long story short, Sinterklaas became Santa Claus, and since his celebration was on December 6th, they didn't have many resources back then, they decided to combine that celebration with Christmas. So that's how Sinterklaas became associated with Christmas.
Oh, wow, I had no idea.
Most people don't. And a lot of people also confuse it with Kris Kringle, which is an entirely separate tradition.
That's someone totally different?
That's a German tradition, and that comes from Christkindl, which means Christ child. So that's talking about Jesus. That's Christkindl, Kris Kringle. Totally separate.
That's mind-blowing.
But both have religious origins. So people who say that Santa's stealing Christmas from Christians, et cetera, are mistaken. They all have religious roots to them.
Well, there's a lot of fake news running around.
There's a lot. That's what I hear.
And tell me some of the advocacy work that you call up these people in Washington about.
Well, health, safety, and welfare, there are a lot of children who are going through the adoption process or foster care. A lot of states have different regulations, but they're not necessarily uniform. Most of the states have been trying to agree on certain things, but sometimes children will fall through the cracks, or the parents can't quite go through all the hoops to make an adoption happen, or foster care for that matter. And it's tough on the children. I used to see a lot of children fall through the cracks when I was in law enforcement a long time ago. It's hard to believe, but...
Police officer, or were you?
Well, back in 1971 and 72, long before my Santa years, I had an Irish name back then, but I was special assistant to the Deputy Police Commissioner of New York City.
Wow.
That was a long time ago.
What the heck did you do when you were in that position?
Had all sorts of jobs. I set up the first video unit in any police department in the United States, and that was subsequently copied by a lot of other departments, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, etc. They used it for training, surveillance, that sort of stuff.
Okay.
It was fascinating because I was very young at the time, and there I was in leather pants, believe it or not, a work shirt. I had hair halfway down my back, a big mustache. Of course, was a lot younger, and had a ball. I was like number 8 in the police department. So out of 26,000 back then, now it's like 38,000 people in the police department in New York City.
And that was in New York back in the 70s.
Yep, early 70s. That's
back before the gentrification, and you had to just be a trust fund kid to afford a one-bedroom apartment.
pretty much, except in certain places like Greenwich Village, where that's where I used to live. Mm. Yeah, it was fun back then.
I bet.
Only had 2 people to report to, which was even better. The police commissioner and my boss, who was the deputy commissioner of administration.
So what kind of stuff did you see when you were a police officer with these kids?
Just saw a lot of kids being left behind, a lot of kids being abused or exposed to domestic violence, poor educations, a lot of injuries at home.
Probably hungry.
A lot of them were hungry. Some school programs took care of some of that, but not uniformly. So it was kind of frustrating to see, and through the years, in and out of law enforcement, I've had ability to sort of calm people down in extreme situations. I had become a police chaplain for a while, and people seemed to like it. The law enforcement people liked it because they could go about their work, and I would sort of take care of the survivors of whatever incident it happened to be. And a lot of people back then started suggesting that I go into the ministry, which is what I did eventually, and a bishop in the small church, and a monk in the order of the Anam Cara. And Anam Cara is the Gaelic or Celtic word for soul friend.
Mm-hmm. So what do your vows include in that brotherhood?
Well, we have
Santa,
a choice.
you're blushing.
We have a choice of vows. I chose poverty. Some other people picked chastity and other things that they were interested in having as part of their life.
But you didn't give up marijuana.
Did not.
Right.
I used cannabidiol to treat my cancer. I was diagnosed about almost 5 years ago, and refused chemo and radiation since my particular cancer was caused by exposure to chemicals and radiation. So why would I take chemotherapy and radiation to cure what
Makes
caused
sense
the initial
to me.
cancer?
Right.
So I stuck with the combination of THC and CBD, cannabis, mostly CBD, and it's kept my cancer at bay for, I shouldn't say my cancer, it's kept cancer in me at bay for almost 5 years now.
God bless.
Yeah, so I'm pleased with it.
Excellent.
And I rarely smoke it. I usually take it as cannabidiol, which is sort of like an oil that you can squirt onto your tongue using what looks like a syringe. Make a long story short. And it works, and it keeps me in good humor. And I look at a lot of people who've gone through chemo and radiation, and I'm glad I opted out of that.
It seems like a very difficult journey.
Mm-hmm. It's a difficult journey for anybody who has that.
And you advocate for pot up here.
I do. Our city council in North Pole, Alaska approved having a dispensary, and then some people who were upset about that decided to put forward a proposition that would ban dispensaries from North Pole. Boo. Anyway, they prevailed, and we're not allowed to have dispensaries now in North Pole, Alaska, which is a small community of 2,200 people or so. But the neighboring borough, we have boroughs up here instead of counties, the neighboring borough that we're in, and Fairbanks, which is about 15 to 20 miles away, depending on which area of Fairbanks you're going to, permits dispensaries. And we just had a big election about that earlier this month, and people who wanted dispensaries prevailed, so I was happy about it.
So you're going to get your dispensaries?
We have dispensaries now, but they were going to try and close them down.
Oh, okay. All right. So now people don't have to ask you to deliver it on a sleigh or anything
That's
like
right.
that.
The elves don't have to be bothered with it. The reindeer don't have to be bothered with it.
Focus on the good work.
I don't have to be bothered with it. Yeah, it's all good.
And
they say
this...
Santa's supposed to be a jolly fellow, right?
Yeah, you better say that. That's part of your job description. Mm-hmm. Ho, ho, ho.
That's right.
And you're on the city council. How did that happen?
I am on city council. I ran as a write-in candidate a couple of years ago, and I guess people liked what I had to say and wrote my name in. It's a pretty easy name to remember, so I was lucky on that score. And I've been serving for 2 years. Got another year to go on my term. I won't run again.
No?
No, 3 years is plenty. And I'm also on one of the state commissions. So.
And you have toys to make, joints to roll.
Toys to make. I hardly ever smoke, so I don't roll any joints. But.
Don't ruin it for me, Santa. I know what you're saying, but I have my own version. So what kind of stuff are you doing on the city council up here?
Well, the things that draw the most attention are annexation and taxation, things like that get people to actually come into our meetings. Most of the time, the audience area or attendees, they hardly ever show up.
Really?
But they like to complain after we make a decision about stuff. So it is what it is. It's a sort of politics on a smaller scale. But we've been very blessed to have had, at least the 2 years I've been here, and now this third one coming up, a very well-rounded city council. We have at least one person on city council out of 7, including the mayor, who represents even the smallest portion of the population here with whatever they would like to see government doing. So no one's left out, whether it's an LGBT question or the pot question or taxes. In fact, the taxes is a good example. Right after the proposition passed that banned a dispensary, the city council, who had previously approved a dispensary, decided, well, now we're losing more than $50,000 a year in tax revenue from what we would have had from cannabis sales. So we elected to cover that shortfall by increasing the sales tax. So if people don't do their homework when these propositions come up, they're going to get stuck with things they didn't anticipate later on. So the people who were pro banning a dispensary at the time, that resulted in a tax increase. So people have to pay more attention to what their politicians are doing and why they're doing it.
Do you think a lot of politicians sneak stuff under the rug?
Not so much here in City Council. We're pretty transparent here, and we give a lot of notice, but on some government levels, like the federal level, I would say yes.
Yeah. I'm going to leave that there. I want to talk about Katrina with you, because, I'm from New Orleans area. That's where
I know. I mentioned to you, I left a little message for you saying that right after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, I was working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency responding to disasters, and those were 2 of the disasters. And our response unit was stationed in Dallas, Texas, and there's a federal disaster recovery center, and we were set up on the state, federal, and local level to award different grants of aid, et cetera, to people who had survived the hurricanes who were being shipped over by FEMA or whomever to Dallas to get their feet back on the ground. It was quite the experience. The director of that particular center wound up putting me at the front door, essentially, to comfort families and children coming in. I was wearing the blue FEMA shirt with FEMA written on it and the jeans, and welcoming people. And people were wonderful. The people who came in, when I'd ask them how they were doing, because some were having a tough time, most of them were. The answer I got most often was, we're blessed. Which, when you see people in really bad shape, it's unexpected to hear the word blessed, but that's how they felt, and they were, of course. But it was very kind of refreshing and a good lesson for those of us working on the front line with FEMA at that time.
I bet.
There was at one point I was talking to some children, and off to my right, I heard this faint little voice saying, "Santa, Santa," like that. I thought it was another child, but I turned around to see who it was, and about 20 feet away, there was this wheelchair. There was an elderly woman sitting in it, and she said, "Santa, I've been waiting 94 years to meet you, Santa. You come over here, boy." Like that. And there's this beautiful black woman who was there with a ton of other people that just wanted to say hi to Santa after all those decades of thinking about Santa in New Orleans. So it was kind of refreshing to see that kind of attitude. It was kind of cute. And it reminded me, I have family, part of my family comes from the New Orleans area back during the cotton farming days. And there's a little fountain outside the zoo in New Orleans, and it's called the Gumbel Memorial Fountain. And that's
I know that fountain.
my mother's father's family.
Oh, wow.
Small world.
It's a totally small world. Yeah, because, I live in Nevada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to live at Lake Tahoe, so you know Nevada.
It's
that whole
beautiful.
area.
Nevada's beautiful. Alaska's beautiful, too.
Yeah, it is.
To me, it's like Nevada, but with snow. And you ran for president.
I did twice, 2008 and 2012. It was quite an experience. A lot of the compliance stuff was driving me crazy because I'm just one person without an organization.
What's that, the
behind
compliance
me.
stuff?
Federal Election Commission stuff. All these filing things you have to make and setting up a bank thing and all sorts of
Why don't you just call the Russians and say, give a brother an assist?
I guess they weren't that much involved back then.
It's
They
right across
probably
the
were.
way, bro. We're in Alaska.
Yeah, I can almost see it from here. I know Sarah can see it, but I'm not sure too many of us can see it. Maybe on a clear
Well,
day.
she's on better oil.
That's right.
What was your platform? Remind me.
My platform, the slogan was Restoring America's Heart and Soul. I figured at the time, way back in 2008 and 12, and currently, this past election as well, I think could have used a little infusion of heart and soul.
Yeah.
I kind of like Bernie myself. I think he embodies that, but the chips fell where they fell.
Yep. You can't go back in time. I like Bernie, too.
But now that I see all the fallout of the changes regarding the environment and social services and the impact it's having on millions of children, like 75 million children, it's distressing to me. I would like to see some major changes made. I think some of the appointments to head different departments are somewhat suspect and, in my opinion, lacking.
Yeah.
I'm saying that as clergy, as a politician, and as a fellow who got all through his doctoral studies at New York University, never did the dissertation because of a timing thing. But I've had a fair amount of experience. I think I have a pretty good idea of how the federal government works or doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Right.
Right. They tell us it's working, but I don't think it is either.
And people talk a lot about those entitlement programs, stuff like that. I see it a lot with little children. Children will actually run up to me and say, Santa, I want an Xbox, or I want an iPad, or whatever. And I'll usually look at them and smile and say softly, no, I don't want to hear your wish. And I said, what do you mean? You're Santa. And I said, well, what I'd like to hear is what you're planning to give someone else for Christmas. There's usually a pause. And sometimes the children will think of something to say, after which I'll be happy to listen to their wish, whatever it happens to be. And sometimes they'll say, well, we don't have any money, Santa, so we can't get anybody a gift. And then I'll say, well, what do you think the greatest gift you can give someone is? And more often than not, the child, without any prompting, will come up and say love, which is true.
Oh, you can make me cry. That is so true. So what would you have done differently if you were our president? Because you did run twice.
I did run. I had a great lineup for the cabinet at the time, and
Who would your cabinet be?
I'd have to go look up the paperwork now. But they were all people that wanted to stick with that heart and soul part of government. And they're few and far between, but they're the exact opposite of what's been put in place recently. And it kind of saddens me because this has an impact on all, children look at what adults do for better or for worse. And I think at the moment we're encouraging children to be hateful, spiteful, not necessarily as loving as they should be, and it saddens me. So I would like to see some major changes pretty soon. And it's not so much having to do with the party or even with a particular candidate. It's a bunch of candidates and a bunch of people who are in political office now who are not serving their constituents or this country well. And I think it's pretty obvious to people in our country and people outside of our country and to God. So I would like to see some major changes.
I think we need to start listening to each other more. That's one place to start. There just seems to be so much hatred and upheaval, finger pointing. But it's kind of like every time you point a finger, you got three coming right back at you.
That's right.
So.
That's very true. But the nice part is comedy and keeping a sense of humor. I'd like to see that prevail rather than what we're dealing with right now.
It does seem like we're having a shift in consciousness, though, doesn't it? Or maybe I'm
hope
just
so.
Being too optimistic?
I think people are speaking out more about their preferences. And our most recent occupant of the White House was only elected by, 25% of the
Yeah, a lot of people didn't come out.
voters.
A lot of people didn't come out to vote.
So to say, I have a mandate to do this, that, and the other thing is bogus, I think. If his opponent had won, she wouldn't have had a mandate either. So something very fundamental has to change. That's why I think a lot of people were heartened by Bernie's campaign and some of the campaigns that are going on right now at the state and federal level and even local level, like little city councils like ours here in North Pole, that change is afoot. And I think we'll start seeing that this next election cycle, and it'll be increasing from then on, I hope. At least that's what I'm praying for.
Yeah.
And particularly for children. We have to set a better example for children. It's supposed to be love, not fear.
I wholeheartedly agree. These kids are nonpartisan. Mm-hmm. They're just human beings that have no power.
That's right.
They can't even get themselves a cookie just to deal with the stress eating of being upset.
Yeah, and they look to us for some sort of direction, and many aren't allowed, or thinking for themselves is not encouraged, and sometimes it's drummed out of these children. And we see it in the education. I would personally like to see that the U.S. Department of Education be a clearinghouse for all sorts of educational programs throughout the world, some of which are more effective at certain aspects, but let states here choose which parts of those programs they would like to adopt for their state. And then if a state makes really poor choices, no one's going to hire their adults, and that situation will change pretty quickly because of the economics.
And that's what's coming if we don't get it together.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't think people are looking 10, 20, 35, 45 years down the road. So many of us make our choices based on what's now. Mm-hmm. And that next set of bills are going to come down. Yep. You know what I mean? We're not taking care of these kids.
And there are a lot of unanticipated consequences to things.
And there's karma.
And there's karma. That's right. Karma, a lot of people don't realize with karma, you're not supposed to, like when you die, you're not supposed to have excess good karma or excess bad karma. You're supposed to be neutral. That's the whole thing.
That's the whole purpose.
Karma.
You have to walk right. I don't think a lot of people understand the concept. Like, God is the one who created karma. That's a universal law put into place.
Yeah, and we all experience it.
God has
later.
other things to sort out and deal with, so He's like, you run this, and or she has other things to deal with. So there's a lot Creator has to focus on. Human beings just go ahead and work through your stuff. It's all part of the Akashic record anyway.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, I got it right. Santa agrees. I want to have a big, big candy cane in my stocking for that, Santa. This year.
I'll do my best.
You can make it medicinal if you want to, brother. Okay. I don't want to alienate anybody who listens to this podcast because I didn't vote for our current president, Donald J. Trump. And I think a lot of people voted for him because they didn't want stuff status quo.
Yeah, I think they wanted a change.
A change.
But I think, unfortunately, one of the things that this particular person in office has a problem with his predecessor in particular, and is doing more to negate what his predecessor did than build on what his predecessor did, perhaps change it. But instead of doing this in a positive fashion, he's blocking out pretty much everything from the recent past and just doing the exact opposite, which really doesn't serve our country well. And to have that sort of personality where it's sort of vindictive to you, I'm not sure if that's the correct word, but I think it's pretty close, really isn't, in my view, an effective or good presidential posture.
Because it's aggressive.
It's aggressive. It's more of dividing up people. It's not sort of president of the United States. It's more president of states.
That's a good way to look at it. And what do you think about this North Korea action?
I think we're in some trouble because unlike Saddam Hussein, and despite whatever people think about our intelligence community, et cetera, I think there's some pretty bright people in there, but despite our misreading of, either intentional or otherwise, of what was going on back then, North Korea can actually do something to back up what they're saying. Saddam Hussein couldn't. So it's not like we're going to run over and do something to North Korea without some pretty severe consequences, which will have an impact again, building up the military, et cetera. My heart goes out to a lot of people who serve in the military, but I think they have a hard taskmaster. I don't think it's so much protecting our liberty or our freedom. I think it's more they're being assigned to efforts that are going to increase the wealth of the 1% in our country, and I'm not for that at all.
Isn't that what usually happens in a war?
Oh yeah,
Someone
defense
will profit while
contractors and
everybody-
the rest of it, yeah. And politically, it draws attention away from other more critical but essential things like health, safety, and welfare. And here we have this gigantic budget for defense, but we can't afford to help people in Puerto Rico. I lived in Puerto Rico for a while, and also the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they're struggling, and these are United States citizens. And to go through what they've been going through recently is really poor form on the part of this administration.
We could do better.
We could do better.
Way better.
And having worked with FEMA, I know we could do better. I think the Coast Guard's been doing a wonderful job, the best they can, just like they did during Katrina and Rita responses for those hurricanes. But I'm sort of left wondering why this administration keeps making these decisions that have a very negative impact on our health, safety, and welfare. And I think you were talking before about short-term gains versus long-term. projections, I think the long term is just being totally ignored, whether you look at the banking sector or the defense sector or even healthcare. I mean, just look at what's happening with healthcare.
Why can't we just get Medicare for everybody?
I would love to see that. I'm on Medicare because I'm 70 years old now, and Medicare has been, great for me, and it has been for people in other countries that have equivalent, systems. Ours is lacking. I like what Bernie had to say about Medicare for all and what a lot of other senators are saying about it and countries. And I would like to see that happen here sooner than later. And what some of these cuts that the administration's been proposing have a profound negative impact on child health, safety, and welfare. A lot of children are falling through the cracks through no fault of their own. And just to have an administration that's adamant about tearing apart a predecessor's programs instead of trying to improve them, or offering replacements that just aren't well thought out, particularly for the long run, I think is unconscionable. So my heart goes out to the children and their families who are suffering as a result of some of these decisions that are being made. And as we talked about earlier, I think it is, a lot of people say, oh, the president's responsible for this, or the leader of the House is responsible, or, whomever, they try and pin it on a person. Well, no, it's the voters who are responsible for this. They're basically not well educated enough to know the issues or what the impacts of certain decisions will be.
And we're only told half of it, if that.
If that.
Like you get this little piece of information, but then you don't hear all this other stuff.
Yeah, and kids look at this, you see it in the textbooks, and the textbooks don't really reflect what history was.
It's a lot of propaganda, isn't it?
It's a lot of propaganda. And then when children now grow up, they're going to be looking at things like the World Trade Center bombing and then the planes and all that stuff, or President Kennedy being shot, or his brother being shot, or Martin Luther King. Nobody seems to have the guts to get to the bottom of why these things, these specific incidents occurred, and whether they're inside government or outside of government. Nobody seems to have the will or the strength or inclination to getting to the bottom and holding people accountable. The United States has a really poor record in holding people accountable for stuff, whether it's a corporation or a government agency or whatever. It's, oh, well, we just denied your permit for whatever. Well, no, a particular individual or a small group of individuals, denied
The
your
corporation
permit.
denied your permit.
Right.
Yeah. This is a corporation.
Mm-hmm. But it's actually individuals
Yeah.
who
Well,
do it, and they're the ones who should be held accountable.
but they get held up or upheld by these
Yeah.
machines.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Isn't that unfortunate?
It is, particularly for children. How are corporations people? I mean, I don't know how they got away with that one. But to have
Yeah,
a
that
little
was a
child
Supreme
try and
Court
understand
decision
that. Yeah.
a few years back. You would know more about that than I.
Yeah, it was.
But I do know corporations are actual people, according to the government. Very counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is.
To me, that's just, it's patriarchy, though. It's that double think. It's like, we're going to tell you this, but we're going to do this. And, but I don't know. I see it differently. I think we're all going by these laws that were set in place by some of our great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers.
Mm-hmm.
And that, meaning some of us, meaning not all of us, meaning just one segment of the population, the landowners,
I do know.
making up all these rules, and we're still kind of living under this false idea of being free.
Yeah, and the children see all this. What kind of a future is that to present to children? Why, children look at us, well, how come all these people in Darfur or other places are starving to death? I mean, we have enough money in this country that's just sitting. It's not even doing anything productive, but just sitting in banks or in property or whatever that isn't being used for anything constructive. And now someone wants to talk about, let's say, the inheritance tax, which affects, 0.6% of, people. And and that's billions and billions of dollars, which could go to education or something else the government might be interested in doing for people instead of to people.
Yeah, you should have been president.
I should have been president. I'm not a woman, of course, but you're being a woman, and there are plenty of women around. I'm looking at all the Me Too campaigns and all the other stuff that's coming out, and somebody grabbing whomever by whatever.
Right.
And if I were a woman, I would be really ticked off that men are making it this difficult. And what kind of a lesson is that for children?
Exactly.
Why should younger boys feel as though they have to control a woman, for example?
They're taught it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's taught at every level. It's taught in the family, it's taught in the community, it's taught in school, it's taught in phys ed, it's taught pretty much everywhere.
Well, it's patriarchy. It's their imprint on the little boys, too. It damages young boys who grow into men who are just as caught up in the system because they've been trained, if you're a man, this is, how you're going to do it. And
it's a language, too. They say, oh, a woman was raped. Well, no, a man raped a woman. It's a whole different dynamic. Mm-hmm. So instead of concentrating on, oh, it's so sad this happened, blah, 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 no, it's who did it, why, and how you're going to prevent it in the future. But no, they don't really talk about that very much or put the responsibility onto the guy. It's, oh, no, it's, what was she wearing again?
What did
which
she
is
do?
Ridiculous, yeah.
Right. Where was she?
Yeah, and kids pick up on that as well. And people's tones of voice and...
The whispering.
Yeah, the whispering.
I remember the
whispering. That'd be crazy. So for me, as Santa, it's difficult seeing children exposed to those kinds of paradigms that aren't really set up in their best interest.
It's shifting. We're dialoguing now. I will tell you, there's change already. I had to take 3 flights to get here, and there was no manspreading.
No?
And typically when I'm on the flight, I have to, just stand my ground.
Kind of subways and stuff in New York.
Set the tone for the first 20 minutes of the flight, like, brother. I'm in my space. You stay over in yours, or we're going to be cool. But there was none of that. There was none of that trying to move me just a few inches to the left or the right.
How about TSA?
TSA, I'm trying to... TSA, actually, I'll tell you what. I'm not a fan of the TSA. I think it's security theater. I've gone through plenty of checkpoints with stuff, and I get to the other side of the go-through, and I'm like, oops, I shouldn't have had that. Didn't mean to. It wasn't trying to break any laws, but...
How about the little children getting searched and groped, etc.?
Oh, it's just somebody wants to touch a kid, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think it has more to do with that love versus fear paradigm. As long as people can instill fear in other people, they think they can control them more effectively. And that's what I see coming out of the White House. That's what I see coming out of the different agencies, federal agencies particularly, and sometimes state agencies. Even our legislature has problems here in Alaska. We have a lot of remote areas. And
that's why I like it.
But it makes it difficult for somebody who might be LGBTQ, or makes it difficult for somebody who might be weaker or being bullied. It makes it difficult for people that have their own voice and don't necessarily blend in and really shouldn't have to.
The outliers, the visionaries.
Yeah. So I know there are a lot of changes going on. I hope I live long enough to see some of the good ones come through.
Will you keep taking that CBD?
Yeah, I will. In the meantime, for people who are worried about Santa Claus, North Pole, and dying, be aware that it's the Christmas spirit. It's the spirit of love. It's the spirit of giving that lasts. It's not a particular person. So there are plenty of helpers out there who are willing to pick up where I might leave off or another Santa might leave off. So you're never without a Santa Claus somewhere.
Never, ever. You can always tap into love.
That's right.
Thank you, Santa.
Thanks, Lisa. It's been my pleasure.
It's been mine. And I want that red bike you never brought me when I was 8, okay? So if you can do something about that.
So I give a blessing to you and to your listeners.
Yes, please. It's better than a bike.
This is Santa Claus, North Pole, Alaska. May you have a lifetime filled with happiness, peace, good health, prosperity, and most of all, love, which is the greatest gift.
Amen. Thank you so much, Santa Claus, for sitting down with me and for all of the listeners. And thank you for everything you're doing in North Pole, Alaska, for the kids and the other people there in the community. Y'all come join me at lisalandry.com. Sign up for my newsletter so that you can get a free audio download from my last album. Special shout out, Ari. I love you. I wish you were here. Santa has something special for you, and I'll bring it to you.